We're transitioning into a new unit today. In the first unit, we looked at metaphysics and epistemology. So we were concerned with trying to describe what all this is, what makes everything up, how it got here, and how we can know that. Metaphysics, the study of the nature of reality. Epistemology, the study of knowledge. Well, in each one of the units that we're looking at in this class, we're going to be studying a different field of philosophy. This second unit, I think, is one that is going to provoke a lot of discussion, because I think everybody here has kind of different views on whether something is good or bad, what makes an action right or wrong. That's exactly what we're going to be looking at the next few weeks. Thus, we're transitioning into what you might call ethical theory. We're going to look at what makes an action right or wrong, why, how does that work, what should we care about if we're trying to be good people, how do we become good people? We're starting off with a fairly easy view today. I think one that is fairly intuitive, but one that has something important to say about what it means to do something right, what it means to perform a moral action, as opposed to an immoral action. To do that, we're looking at an essay by John Stuart Mill. Now, Mill is another influential thinker in the history of Western philosophy. Along with John Locke, he's known for his political theory in pioneering classical liberalism, which undergirds a lot of Western societies, and more specifically, U.S. society. The ideas that the Founding Fathers had, what their conception of government was, the kind of role it should play in human life. He details this in his famous essay on liberty. But today we're not going to be talking about his political theory. We're going to talk about his ethical theory, which he got, I think, from a figure known as Jeremy Bentham, who is another important figure in the Western tradition. If my memory serves, Jeremy Bentham was something like a mentor to J.S. Mill, and so naturally some of his views rubbed off on Mill as well. So what is he doing in this piece? Well, he's going to give us a bunch of arguments. He's going to try to describe for us what makes an action moral and immoral and why. He's going to try to defend this view from some objections. And I hope that after we get all this on the table, we can kind of have a discussion about this and see what you all think. I should say one more thing before we actually get into what Mill says. There are a lot of different views on ethics. That is, how to act rightly, how to act good. Some people think that morality is relative. It's just relative to the culture or time or society that you live in. Some people think that when we make moral statements, we're not really saying much at all. We're making something of an error because there aren't these things called moral facts that exist in the world. The thinkers that we're going to be looking at this week and next week don't agree with those views. So from the get-go, we're going to make a few assumptions about the nature of morality. For the purpose of this class, and Mill, Kant, and Aristotle that we're going to be looking at, we're going to assume that there is a fact of the matter about whether an action is right or wrong, and there's a fact of the matter about what makes an action right or wrong. This view is known as moral realism, slightly similar view. moral objectivism. That's what these ideas are associated with. Because I think generally that's kind of what our intuition tells us. There are right and wrong things to do. There are worse and better ways to live. We seem to rely on that idea in our society, and we seem to presume it when we tell people you should do this, you shouldn't do that. So, even if perhaps you don't think you believe that morality is objective, or there are facts of the matter about what's right and wrong, I think our actions often do support that view. So, what Mill is going to be presenting for us today is a particular view about what makes an action objectively right or objectively wrong. And as we'll see, that view is utilitarianism. But before we get there, let me just offer you kind of a general overview of the article I asked you to read for today. Mill is doing a lot of things in this article. His goal is to make some sort of meaningful contribution to moral philosophy. If you did the reading, you will have seen that in the beginning pages, he kind of complains about the state of moral philosophy, that not much progress has been made on it, that people have all these wrong ideas about it. So he actually wants to write something that's going to help people, that's going to make progress in this domain. He's going to try to support this view of utilitarianism, what it is, why it matters, how we can get people to be utilitarians. And then he's going to defend that view from various objections. Bless you.
Thank you.
I got some nice new markers, so life is good, isn't it? Now, obviously, there are a lot of different views on what makes an action right or wrong, right? We're going to look at 3 or 4 views in this class, and they're all going to provide different criteria for this. We're starting with Mill because I think this is one of the easiest views, one of the most intuitive, and I think it's a nice, gentle introduction to this field. Now, to give you some historical context, there was a view kind of circulating around the time that Mill was writing that thought that people have some sort of innate moral sense to just see when something is right or wrong. This view is known as moral sentimentalism. The moral sentimentalists thought that just like you have a sense of sight or a sense of hearing, you also have this thing called a moral sense that allows you to determine when somebody did a wrong thing or a right thing. One of the things that Mill is doing in this piece as well is he's critiquing this view. He doesn't think that we actually have this spooky, innate moral sense to just see whether something is right or wrong. Rather, if we use our critical thinking skills, our logical reasoning skills, we can come to an understanding of what's right or wrong, but it's not as if we have a sense like we have a sense of taste or a sense of sight or something like that to just tell when we see an immoral action or a moral action. In this way, we can say that his philosophy is going to have some sort of similarities with Kant that we're going to look at next week, who thinks that we can determine whether an action is right or wrong before anybody does it just through reason, just by applying our reasoning skills. And for Kant, as we'll see, somehow rationality and morality are inextricably linked. But we'll get to that next week. Now, what he's going to do in the rest of this piece is provide an explanation of his particular ethical theory. He's going to try to support it with some arguments. He's going to provide a brief sketch of how we can incentivize people to follow this view, because he thinks if people did, life would be a lot better, the world would be a lot better. And then he's going to defend it at the end of the piece from some objections that you might have from this view. So, as we go through this, just think in the back of your mind whether or not you agree with this view, and if not, what you think its weaknesses are, because I hope to have a little bit of a discussion today. In order to understand what his view is getting at, I need to give you a little bit of background. There are a bunch of different theories about what makes an action moral or immoral. Kant is basically going to say, this is an oversimplification, but it's your intention that matters. If you have the proper intention, then your act is good or bad on that basis. Aristotle's going to look at things slightly differently. The feminist ethicists of care are going to say relationships are the ground of human life, and so whether or not you're being a good person and doing right stuff is determined by whether or not you're sustaining and building up your relationships with others, because that's on relationships, that's on which everything turns and depends. Mill's view falls within a particular camp of ethical theories that is known as consequentialism. Consequentialism. What do you think this view is going to say? What word do you see in that term I just wrote on the board? Consequence. Yeah, good. So, what do you think this view is going to say makes an action right or wrong? The consequences of it, exactly. It's this term, this view, is the view that the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. So whether an action is right or wrong depends on the consequences it produces. This is kind of an umbrella term for a bunch of different ethical theories. Because if you just knew that somebody was a consequentialist, that doesn't give you much information about what they think makes an action right or wrong, right? Oh, it's based on the consequences. Well, what kind of consequences are we talking about, right? Maybe I have an ethical theory. I'm going to call it cakeism. It says an action is right or wrong if it gets me cake or not. That would be an example of a consequentialist theory, right? Whether or not an action is good or bad is determined by its consequences. Which ones? Whether or not I get cake as a result. Or you could have a different consequentialist view. Let's call it social justiceism. an action is right or wrong, whether or not it produces social justice. That would be another example of a consequentialist view, right? So think of this as kind of an umbrella term. A bunch of different views could fit into this. The particular view that Mill is going to espouse and argue for is one particular kind of consequentialism. It's known as utilitarianism. All right, what word do you see in this term? Utilitarianism. Yeah. Utility, yeah. What do you think that means? Or what pops up for you when you hear that word?
Just like using something as a tool or something.
There's like a practical aspect to it, right? Yeah. Yeah. Another way that you could think about it is this word utility has certain connotations and associations that have to do with whether something is good for something else, right? It brings your life utility. Mill is going to mean something just a little bit more specific than what we think of when we hear the word utility. Basically, what he's going to say is whether an action is right or wrong is determined by whether or not it produces suffering in the world or happiness. That's what his view is. So he says in the reading, utilitarianism is the view that, quote, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, that is, pleasure and absence of pain, wrong in proportion as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness, or suffering and pain. So basically what Mill is going to argue is that whether an action is right or wrong is determined by whether it raises the happiness levels in the universe or lowers the happiness levels in the universe. That's one way that you could think about it. It's kind of a mathematical view. Why do I say that? Well, basically it thinks that it's possible to look at the current state of things, look at how animals are doing, how humans are doing, how organisms are doing generally that have the ability to experience pleasure and pain, suffering and joy and all that stuff. It's going to say, if we can quantify that, if we can quantify the amount of happiness in the world, if you want to be a good person, what you got to try to do is raise that. You want to act such that, well, you produce more pleasure and happiness and joy in the world, as opposed to suffering, pain, displeasure. And there are a lot of different ways that you could think about this, right? What exactly do we mean by this term happiness? What do you think happiness means? Well, what makes you happy? Does getting stabbed in the neck make you happy? Oh, what makes you happy? Drugs? You're like, yeah, but I'm not going to say that. Alcohol, sex, nice pillows, your pet, having friends, maybe getting a good workout in if you're somebody who likes to go to the gym. Yeah, all of these things could be considered as bringing people happiness, generally. Obviously, we have different tastes and desires, but yeah. Basically, what happiness means for Mill is pleasure. But not just sensuous pleasure, not just the pleasure of the body. He's also going to be talking about the pleasures of the mind later. What he's going to call higher pleasures. So, another way that you could put this, and these are words that utilitarians use, is an action is right or wrong if it produces pleasure, or sometimes they'll use this word utility. Basically what they mean by that is making the world a better place, whether or not your actions make the world a better place for everyone. Sometimes they use this word well-being, whether or not your action produces well-being. This is the basic view that Mill has. The morality of an action is determined by its consequences. Which ones? Well, whether or not those actions produce these things. He is going to be using this word, but utilitarians kind of use these interchangeably sometimes. That's the idea they're trying to get at. Now, according to our Western tradition, there are two different kinds of utilitarianism, two different sub-theories, you might say. What are called rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism. I'm just going to abbreviate it because I'm lazy. Rule utilitarianism is the view that we ought to perform those actions that, in general, most of the time, produce the most utility. And I'll give you an example of this. Let's say that you have a family, you're married to the love of your life, you have a kid, your kid has grown up, they're away at college, and they get murdered. They get murdered by some freak man for no apparent reason. Obviously, the guy gets arrested, but it looks like he has a good lawyer. It looks like he might get away with this crime. Because even though you know in your heart of hearts that he did it, it doesn't seem like the jury is going to convict him. Maybe they don't think enough evidence is there. Well, what should you do in this situation? If you're faced with the option of following him into a back alley after the trial is done and killing him, should you do that or should you not do that? Well, rule utilitarianism is basically going to say, look, we've been on this earth a while. We know generally what produces the most happiness. We have a pretty good sense of that. Generally in our country, respecting people's rights is what produces the most utility for people. We don't like to violate people's rights. So, rule utilitarianism might recommend in this situation that you have to respect his right to due process. You have to respect the conclusion that the jury came to. Because in general, most of the time, that's what we should do if we're trying to make the world a better place. So you can't kill him in a back alley during or after the trial if he's not convicted. Even though you want to do that. Because respecting people's rights, following due process, doing all this stuff, in general, most of the time, has the best consequences for everyone. So we could say that this view follows general rules. Okay? We have a good sense, it'll argue, of which actions make the world a better place, produce the most happiness. We should follow general rules like that. Because most of the time, following them is going to produce a net positive for everyone. Okay? We can contrast this view with what's known as act utilitarianism. If rule utilitarianism is, well, kind of general and says we should follow general rules, act utilitarianism is much more context dependent. It's going to say that we ought to perform those actions that will produce the most utility in every specific situation. So every situation is unique. If you want to do what's right, you need to do that thing that is going to produce the most amount of happiness in that situation. So, if we go back to our example, your daughter is murdered by this guy. It looks like he's going to get off because he has a good lawyer. What would act utilitarianism recommend? Screw due process. When there's a recess, you go murder that guy behind the building. Why? That's going to establish justice for your daughter. That's going to prevent him from murdering people in the future. It's going to take a vile person off the streets. It's going to make you feel better. If we consider everybody's interests and desires, everybody's happiness, what's going to produce the most happiness in this situation is getting rid of that guy. So that's what you should do. So do you see the general difference between these two? Rule utilitarianism is going to say, look, you should follow those rules that in general most of the time make everything better. And act utilitarianism is going to say, no, screw the rules. You got to do what produces the most utility in every situation that you're faced with. It's context dependent. Every situation is different. If you know for sure that this guy did it and he might do it again, you're obligated to kill him. That's what you got to do. If you can solve world hunger forever by killing 1 million people, yeah, that's what you got to do. Even though killing is generally wrong, and it would say, no, you can't kill 1 million people to solve world hunger. This one's going to say, no, duh, solve world hunger forever? If you look down the line, how much suffering that's going to prevent, how much happiness that's going to bring, yeah, you do that. So when utilitarians are trying to figure out what they should do, they're going to look at their own interests, what's going to bring them happiness for themselves. They're going to look at those around them and their family and their community. They're going to look at the global community as well. They're going to imagine what consequences their actions are going to have, perhaps far into the future, not just immediately. And some utilitarians, like Peter Singer, for example, is going to say, when you're trying to figure out what to do, you should also consider in your thoughts not just human suffering, but also animal suffering. Because animals can suffer, and they can experience happiness, so they should also be a part of your moral calculus, if you will. So, utilitarianism is all about trying to produce net positive good, everyone considered. Does that make sense? So, for example, let's say you have 3 friends, and you really love surprise parties. You love hosting them, you love getting them, and your friend's birthday is coming up, and they hate surprise parties. They really hate surprises. They don't want a surprise party. They've told you this. They're going to freak out if they have a surprise party. They're going to feel anxiety. And your 2 friends also don't really love surprise parties that much. What should you do in this situation? Well, what's going to produce the most happiness? You don't throw a surprise party for your friend. Because everybody's desires and interests considered, they don't want a surprise party. Even if it would be good for you and it would make you really happy, if you consider your 3 friends, it would make them more sad than it would make you happy. So you shouldn't throw a surprise party. Does that make sense? So utilitarianism is going to say, when you're trying to figure out what to do, you got to look at how the action's going to impact you, how the action is going to impact others, the consequences it's going to have in the future, and maybe also how it's going to impact animals. Because they can suffer and feel happiness too. What is it that Spock says in Star Trek? The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That's kind of a good summary of utilitarianism. It's trying to maximize happiness in the universe. And so, generally, what it's going to say you should do is try to produce the most happiness for the most amount of people. Because generally that's going to be the best way to go. So, do you find this view intuitive? Does it make sense? Why do you think somebody might come to this view or think this is what makes an action right or wrong? Any ideas? Mill isn't just pulling this out of his butt here. He's got some good reasons for thinking, yeah, this is the view that people should follow. Any idea why? Yeah.
Maybe because it makes you have to step outside of just what you want and look at a bigger picture. You have to be more considerate.
Yeah. Yeah, he's going to say that if people follow this view, the world's going to be a lot better off, for sure, because you're not just thinking about yourself, right? Yeah. But you could also think about it like this. What is your dog fundamentally motivated to pursue in all that they do? What are all organisms trying to pursue at the end of the day? Aren't you? Yeah. Don't you kind of live your life seeking out pleasure and trying to diminish your own suffering and the suffering of those around you, maybe? Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why Mill thinks this is the right view, and this is the view that we should go with, is because, well, all organisms are fundamentally motivated to seek out pleasure and to avoid pain. This is like a basic principle of our biology. This is what we're all motivated to do, and this is what we're basically doing all the time, whether or not we realize it. The same thing is true of dogs and wombats, dolphins. Every organism, it seems, is pursuing its own happiness or its own self-interest, and it's trying to avoid suffering or avoid pain. Thus, he's going to say, the reason why this view is intuitive and makes sense and we should follow it is because pleasure and the prevention of pain is the primary underlying motivation for all living things. Why does your dog lay on the couch rather than on the floor? Well, because it's pursuing its own self-interest and its own pleasure. Why do organisms reproduce? Well, they're seeking their own self-interest, their own pleasure, right? Why do you smoke a joint before bed? Why do you go out clubbing with your friends? Why do you buy nice, cozy sweaters and blankets? Why do you eat food and sleep? You're pursuing pleasure and you're trying to prevent your own suffering. This is what we're all trying to do, Mill thinks. This view, this ethical theory, is basically saying, yeah, that's what we do, and this is how we should act if we're trying to be good people. But again, I want to stress this. If you're going to follow this view, if you think this view is right, you can't just think about your own self-interest. This view, we could say, thinks that an action is moral if it maximizes happiness in the universe. So when you're trying to figure out whether an action is moral or immoral or how to live your life, you have to consider your own interests and everybody else's interests too, the consequences that your action is going to have on the world into the future, all of that stuff. Okay? So whether an action is right or wrong isn't just determined by whether or not you like it, but whether or not it objectively raises the happiness levels in the universe. Thus, it might say something like, look, if you like chocolate cake a little bit, but your friend really loves chocolate cake, and there's only one piece of chocolate cake left, the right thing for you to do is let them have the chocolate cake, because if they eat it, more happiness will be produced in the world than if you eat it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So when they're thinking about what to do and what's right, they're going to try to consider everybody in their thinking. What is going to make the world a better place as a result of my action? That's what they're thinking. Now, when they're doing that, they're going to say, bodily pleasure is not the only thing that matters. Yes, drugs and alcohol and sex and rock and roll is fun, and it produces pleasure, but that's not the only thing that matters. You need to be thinking about other stuff when you're trying to figure out what to do. Thus, Mill is going to say, both the quality and the quantity of pleasure matters. Utilitarianism is not going to encourage a rash hedonism in which you're just pursuing your own individualistic pleasure. Because there are different kinds of pleasure, right? And some pleasures are going to bring more happiness than others. Yeah, maybe getting drunk tonight is going to be fun, but is it going to bring you as much happiness as creating a memory with somebody that you're in love with? Probably not, right? Or finally getting that concept in philosophy class and you have a moment of epiphany and inspiration? Or maybe listening to Bach or Beethoven? Maybe not. So quality and quantity of pleasure matters. So when we're thinking about how we should live, we need to think about what kinds of pleasure or happiness is my action going to produce, and how much is it going to produce. Thus, Mill distinguishes between what he calls higher and lower pleasures. Animals are capable of lower pleasures, just like we are. The pleasures of the body. A nice pillow, nice food, something feeling warm and soft, a nice drink. Yeah, those are pleasurable, but Mill would call those lower pleasures. Both humans and animals are capable of those. But Mill doesn't think that just chasing after those is going to bring humans fulfillment. There are these things called higher pleasures that we can also experience that are of better quality, higher quality than just the pleasures of the body. Thus, humans are capable of fulfillment and mental satisfaction as well, not just the satisfaction of bodily desires and urges. Humans can experience enlightenment and love and meaning and purpose, religious experiences, seeing an awesome piece of art that transforms your life, or giving such a dance performance that you wow yourself and everybody else, right? And it means something to you. and you'll never forget it. Humans are capable of experiencing deep love. These are what he calls the higher pleasures. And according to Mill, these higher pleasures are of a, higher quality than just the lower pleasures. They're longer lasting. They make humans happier and more joyful than just food and drugs. They're more permanent. So, when we're trying to figure out how we should live our lives, we need to think about whether or not our actions are going to produce higher pleasures for ourselves and others. Producing lower pleasures is good, but that's not what life is all about. That kind of life, seeking after lower pleasures, is fit for animals, but he says it's not going to fulfill a human being. If you just chase after the base comforts, you might feel moments of pleasure, but undoubtedly you're going to feel moments of pain too, right? Just think about what happens if you drink a whole fifth tonight. How's that going to feel tomorrow? Or think about what happens if all you do is participate in orgies. Probably not good things, right? Probably susceptible to some bad things that you don't want in your life if you do that, okay? But what's most important is that Mill is going to say these things won't fulfill you. There will be something like a gaping hole in your heart that cannot be filled by these things. It can only be filled by the higher pleasures. Mental satisfaction, a good chess game, a religious experience, finding your purpose in life and following that, following your dreams, that kind of stuff. Love. So, in our actions, Mill is going to say, we shouldn't just try to make people feel comfortable. We should also try to produce joy in them and fulfillment. And in ourselves too. Those things matter more than just, ooh, that feels good. You catch my drift? Now, in this part of the article, I think Mill says something a little bit controversial. And so every year I like asking students this to see what they think. Animals are capable only of lower pleasures. They are not going to experience falling in love like we are, or a good chess match, or an awesome experience listening to Chopin or something. Humans are capable of these higher pleasures because we have a more complex mind. But it's not all good. Because the human mind is more complex, it can see the world in a bunch of different ways. It has all these different capacities that animal minds don't. That also opens humans up to forms of suffering that animals don't have the ability to experience. For example, being cheated on by your girlfriend, or being cheated on by your husband, and the sense of betrayal and loss of trust and how that blows up your world. Yes, we are capable of experiencing deep and meaningful forms of love and connection, but we're also capable of experiencing more acute forms of suffering. And you know this, right? You've experienced deep suffering in your life at some point. Maybe you were extremely depressed or extremely anxious, or you have some trauma that you're still holding on to that is affecting your life. These things aren't fun. For some people, they get so bad that they don't want to go on living. But Mill says that despite this, despite the fact that we are open to different forms and deeper forms of suffering than animals, he thinks that being a human is still somehow intrinsically better. And so the controversial claim he makes in this section is this. He says, it is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And so I put the question to you. Would you rather be a human being and have all the capacities that you do and the ability to experience all these things that animals can't? Or would you rather be a satisfied animal? A cat in a rich person's home, maybe. A dog in Beverly Hills. What do you think? Which life would be better? Would you rather be who you are now, or would you rather be an animal that has all its needs met and has a nice place to lay and is loved on by their owner? What do you think? Yeah.
I'd rather be an animal.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay, speak into that. Why would you rather be an animal?
Because I mean, like, they don't really have to worry about stuff other than just like doing their instinctual stuff, and like they don't have to worry about their own death or anything.
Yeah, I mean, maybe they don't even really think about anything.
Yeah.
Right? They're not plagued by those worries, right? Oh, am I good enough? Does my boyfriend still love me? Am I going to succeed in life? Oh, my impending doom. Right? Okay, so you'd rather be an animal? Even though if you're an animal, you're not going to be able to go to philosophy class and experience falling in love, you know?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I just feel like it's just hard because like sometimes like there's a lot more like suffering than positivity in the world.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. It can get really bad as a human, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I agree. I feel like as an animal, you don't really know that there's better anyway. So like
Yeah.
really good is like really good. And there are studies that like say that like dogs when they see their owner experience the same feeling humans do when they have a hug or like stuff like that. So
Well, it's the same chemical, right?
Right.
But
I feel like if you don't know any more happiness than what you're given, then you can't really imagine there is a better life. I
and
think
so
that
it just is
there's
great to you.
something good in that, yeah. Like the ignorance of that.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe because animals don't have the same mental capacities that we do, they are insulated from a lot of suffering, right? They don't have to be anxious about their philosophy paper.
I mean, other than
Right.
like animals who experience abuse, that's some sad shit too. Like,
Yeah.
they do realize that they're in pain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, animals experience pain, for sure. Yeah. So you would choose to be an animal, if you could?
If I was in a good home.
Okay. So if the choice was before you right now, and it's like, you either have your life, or you can be,
Well, I wouldn't
Harry
want-
Styles' cat.
I wouldn't want to know what humanness felt like before.
Oh, okay.
You know, like
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to know that I had the capability of feeling more complex things because then I feel like I'm missing out as an animal.
Well, if you were turned into a cat, presumably you wouldn't know what you left
Exactly.
behind. Yeah. But if you still had that memory and that knowledge, you'd be like, I don't know, like, that might make me sad. Like, I can't read A Court of Thorns and Roses anymore, or whatever it is. Yeah. Yeah.
I agree that I think I would pick to be a human because you can feel fulfillment and mental satisfaction unlike an animal. And I think that's only because of the deep suffering that you feel as a human. That it's completely subjective to, I mean, you look at like people that are like extremely wealthy and you see them as being extremely shallow because they haven't gone through a lot of hardships. Especially like people that come into generational wealth. They were raised rich, they're going to die rich. They don't go through a lot of hardships in life.
And you think that not having those experiences, it prevents them from having some sort of development and learning and growth and appreciation, gratitude, maybe?
Suffering is what makes human life beautiful, is being able to, not the suffering itself, but in the suffering and then being outside of the suffering. That's part of like what makes it beautiful, is having the suffering, surviving through it, and coming out better for it.
Okay. Okay, so you would rather be a human.
Yeah.
And suffer whatever that is. I mean, obviously you don't want a terrible life, but there's no guarantee we're all going to be happy in the future. I think I'd rather be a human. I like listening to music. I like playing my video games when I have time. I don't like having to pay outrageous vet bills for my cat over the weekend. But oh my God, he brings me so much joy. I wouldn't be able to experience that joy if I was a cat, living with him. So, I love him so much.
Do you think your cat doesn't experience joy around you?
Well, I think he does. I just don't think it's to the same level. I think I get more joy from him than he gets from me.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this? It's kind of similar to the question, would you rather have the life that you have now or never have existed at all? Is there anybody who would choose to never have existed? If you do, I'm sorry. I hope your life isn't too bad. Okay, well, let's continue on then. So this is the basic view that Mill is supporting here, that he's arguing for. The morality of an action is determined by its consequences. Which ones? Well, whether or not your actions produce happiness in the world or prevent suffering. That's what matters. Now, Mill is very clear that if we could just get everybody on board to follow this, life would be so much better. Why? Well, because everybody would be looking out for each other, right? Maybe we'd be more willing to sacrifice our own resources, our own time for others. People would be willing to do that for us. Maybe there wouldn't be so much injustice and oppression in the world. People would be happier, they would get along better. So he thinks that insofar as we're social beings and we live in communities with one another, this is the way to go. Okay, this is what we should be following, and this is what we should encourage other people to follow as well. We should encourage other people to think this way. For everybody's good. So, how are we going to do that? If this is a good view, and if the world would be a better place if everybody believed and followed it, how can we make that a reality? Well, near the end of this essay, he provides a mini guide as to how to get people to think in this way, how to get people to follow this ethical theory. He argues something very practical. He says, look, people are going to do what they're incentivized to do. So, what we need to do is establish the proper incentives, and that'll convince people, that'll compel people to follow this view, to consider others in their decision making, to engage in self-sacrifice, and so on. He says that in order to get people to internalize this, we can use external and internal sanctions. Well, external sanctions are pretty self-explanatory. There are things that we can do socially, legally, in order to incentivize people to be utilitarian. We can reward people for their actions. We can praise them for their actions. We can punish people for their actions. We can take things away from people. We can lock them up. These kinds of external sanctions might push society in the utilitarian direction. So, if you want to get people to follow this view, you recognize when they do something right, you praise them for it, you encourage it. And when somebody does something wrong, you discourage it, you shame it, you tell them that it's wrong, depending on the severity of the action. Maybe you lock them up if it's too severe. Yeah, we can engage in reward and punishment. That'll push people towards this view. But besides external sanctions, we can also appeal to what he calls internal sanctions as well. Because human beings are not robots, right? We're not just cold calculating machines. We also have a thing like a conscience. We have ideas about what is right and wrong. We respond in certain ways when we see things out in the world. So what we could do is appeal to internal sanctions as well to get people to follow utilitarianism. For example, when somebody is going to do something, you might say, well, think about what's right there, right? What is your conscience telling you? What is your gut telling you? What's the right thing to do here? You could appeal to people's personally felt moral obligations, right? That's your brother. You know you have a responsibility to your brother, right? After all he's done for you. That's your mom. He's writing during a time in which a lot of people are still Christians, so he also mentions, remind people that they're supposed to follow God's will. Remind them that they have a devotion, a calling to do right by the creator of the universe. Now, all of these are kind of positive ways of influencing people down the utilitarian path. But you can also appeal to kind of scary, traumatic, horrific things as well. what might get somebody to follow this view and to make the world a better place? Maybe you could expose them to a really graphical picture of a terrible crime. People will have responses to that, right? They'll say, oh my goodness, that's what's happening out there? Wow, we need to change. We need to do something. That's terrible, right? So he mentions, the horrors of crimes, of particularly terrible crimes, might also influence people to think and act in a more collective, considerate way. So, we can do things externally to get people to follow this view, but we could also appeal to the things that are already internal to them. Their own beliefs, their own responsibilities, what they think they're supposed to do because of the relationships that we're in, their conscience, etc. So that's one thing that we can do. How do we get people to follow utilitarianism? We could apply those two things, external and internal sanctions. But perhaps what's even more important than this is education. He says education is going to be key. He thinks one of the reasons why people during his day are not following this view is because they've been conditioned and educated poorly. They didn't have the best upbringing. They weren't taught to, think in this way and to view the world in this way. So we need to make sure that the people in society receive a good moral education. One important part of that is going to be teaching them that their personal happiness is wrapped up with everybody else's in some sense. Your actions don't occur in a vacuum, right? And other people's actions out there also don't occur in a vacuum. Everything that you do and everything that other people do is going to have some sort of effect on how society evolves, whether or not it becomes better or worse. Even just the small things, right? For example, you decided not to work out last night because you're tired and you'd rather lay in your bed. Well, today that makes it so your mood is not as great. And then when you got your coffee this morning, you weren't super patient and kind with the barista. And then that put her in a bad mood, and then she brought that home, and her family is now all upset because she's being rude to them. And then they take that with them out into society, and you see how this goes, right? The consequences don't stop. Everything that you do has consequences, whether you realize it or not. And so Mill thinks we need to teach people that their happiness and well-being is integrated with everybody else's in some fundamental sense. It's that way for everybody. If society's not doing well, you're not going to do well. And if you're not doing well, you're not going to make society better, right? So we need to teach people that in some fundamental sense we are all connected. We are all in this together. The actions of the people out there will have an effect on you at some point. Your actions are going to have effects on them too. He says we're going to have to teach people that it's right and it's noble to place the interests of the people over their own individual interests. So get people to be more selfless rather than selfish. Because if everybody's just doing what's personally good for them, this whole world is going to stay shitty. In this sense, what Mill is kind of encouraging, what utilitarianism encourages, is a willingness to engage in self-sacrifice for the greater good. Why? Because your happiness is not all that matters. Her happiness matters, his happiness matters, everybody out there's happinesses matter. It's not just all about you. And so we need to teach people, we need to educate people that placing other people's interests over your own is a good thing. That's right. That's how you should act. Yes?
Well, I was just going to say, like, a critique of that, though, is just, like, this whole idea is that everybody has a different idea of what happiness is for everyone else. So, like, when you put this idea into, like, a bad person's hands, just because they might think that happiness looks like one way for society, that it's all biased and it's all, like, relative to their culture and their beliefs.
Yeah.
Like a corrupt religious person with this idea is gonna just, like, push their values on a bunch of people who might not need their values, but to that person, that's what brings people happiness, and that's not always true.
Right. So yeah, that is a worry. That's why we have to do this education thing really well. And we have to make it clear what's actually going to make people happy objectively. And we do have a good sense of this, right? Tell me, what's going to make people happy? Making them sleep on concrete beds or giving them soft beds? Soft beds, right? What's going to make people happy? Feeding them McDonald's or feeding them Whole Foods? That's going to be better for them, right? What's going to be better for people? Encouraging them to sit in their chair and play World of Warcraft all day? No, exercise is also important for mood and health and all of that. So Mill's going to say we know generally what's good for people. What's good for people is that they get their needs met, that they live an active lifestyle, that they're engaged probably in some kind of hobby, that they have a proper sleep schedule, that they're not getting drunk every night, that they have a shelter, that they have clothing. So he would say, probably the majority of people agree on that important stuff. But yeah, you're right. Like, people do have differing opinions about what's good for people. Yeah, we might have to tell some people that their beliefs are wrong and point them in the right direction. Yeah. But yeah, that is a worry. Finally, he says, there's another thing that we need to talk about and fix if we're going to make this work. He says one of the reasons why society is so bad and people are not doing well and people have resentment and they're greedy and they're selfish is because there's too much inequality in society. He says inequality breeds resentment, it breeds anger, breeds greed and selfishness and all this stuff. So we need to teach people to do their best to eliminate inequality in society. Because if we don't fix that, we're not going to be able to get everybody on board. Why? Well, think about it. How are you going to convince an individual who is extremely poor and is looking for their meals every day? How are you going to convince them to sacrifice for others if they don't have what they need to live? They're not going to be able to do that. You're not going to get them on board thinking about the public good if they're struggling to survive. Okay, so we have to fix that. We need to level the playing field somehow. So what do you think about this view? Do you like his ethical theory here? What makes an action right or wrong is whether or not it produces happiness or suffering. Does that seem right to you? What do you think? Yay or nay? Is that what makes an action right or wrong? What do y'all think? Or does something else make an action right or wrong? I'm just going to wait. I have no problem waiting 10 minutes until class is over. Yes?
I feel like it's like a good thought, but there's obviously always going to be problems with any of these ideas. But like I think that picking majority always I don't think is the best option. Just because more people feel a certain way doesn't mean that the less amount of people don't feel at all.
Yes.
And like, who are you to say that you know that the majority of these people would be happier when like there's just no way to weigh that. Like I think the scale of it all is what gets confusing because like no one can really measure happiness. Especially when it comes to like the entire world and society. Like how do you know?
So you've hit on a few very important things there. There's one thing that I want to clear up. The first thing that you talked about was just because a lot of people feel happy, that doesn't mean the action is moral. Right?
Yeah.
Which is true. Just think of historical examples. When we were having the Civil War, do you think slavery made the majority happy? Insofar as it was a thing, probably, yeah, they accepted it, they supported it, it helped boosted the economy, right? But was slavery right? Well, we would say no, right? So this is an important point. In general, utilitarianism is going to say those actions that are good tend to promote the most happiness for the largest number of people. But that's not the ultimate goal. There are going to be some cases where actually pleasing the minority group, whoever you're talking about, produces more happiness. For example, in the case of liberating slaves. that's going to produce most happiness, because they're going to be a lot happier that they're free than the free people are going to be a lot less sad that they don't have slaves anymore, right? So, in general, most happiness for the largest number is what we're looking at. But, even more specifically, the goal of utilitarianism is to maximize happiness in the universe. And so there might be situations in which the right thing to do is listen to the small group of people, because that is going to produce the most net positive happiness in the long run. For example, you're having a party. 10 people are coming over to the party. No, let's say 9 people. So there are 10 people total. 10 people total at the party. 3 of them are vegans, and the rest eat meat. The meat eaters don't really care if they eat vegan stuff. They're fine with it. But the vegans cannot eat meat. So, what should you do? Well, the right thing to do is to make sure you have vegan options. Because the vegan people's happiness is going to be much higher because there are vegan options than the meat people's happiness that there are vegan options. Does that make sense? So in that situation, you could imagine the vegan people's happiness, collected all together and counted up, is going to be higher than the meat people's suffering, because there are a few less meat options. Does that track? Does that make sense? So sometimes doing what the smaller group wants is going to produce the most utility in the long run. Because the goal is this. You're trying to maximize happiness in the universe. We could talk about factory farming. That might be another good example. A lot of people in the U.S. are going to be upset if meat production drops. But think of how much happiness you're producing and suffering you're preventing by taking millions of animals out of those terrible conditions. It's not crazy to think the happiness of those animals, when counted up, is going to be larger than the suffering of the people who like to eat meat every day. Does that make sense? So yes, there's that. That's important. Now, what else did you say? Do you remember?
Yeah, like kind of just like, well, the scale was the first part. Also, like who feels like they have the right to like determine what happiness is for other people.
So that's, yeah. I think Mill kind of responds to that at the end of this piece. One of the objections that he considers is, how do I know what I'm supposed to do when I'm faced with a situation? I don't have time to think about how my action is going to impact everybody every time I'm faced with a decision. This is impractical. Well, Mill's response to that kind of hits on what you're saying. He would say, no, look, we know generally what's good for people. We all know, and we all agree on it, right? What's good for you is not me stabbing you in the stomach. What's good for you is me generally being honest with you. What's good for you is that when you come over to my house, I don't feed you plain rice and beans, but I make you something a little nicer.
But what if
right?
you're stabbing me is good for somebody else? Like how you
Well,
gave the example.
that's something that we could probably agree on, right? Like, look, a serial killer comes in here. And we can all tell. They got a crazy look in their eyes, all right? They're going to start murdering. We'd all be like, get rid of that guy. That's the right thing to do. He's going to kill us all. Right? So what Mill kind of says is, look, we've had a lot of time to figure out what's good and right for people, and we kind of already all know what that is. In some instances, it's going to be tricky, and we're really going to have to think about it. But generally, we know. But you're right. It's not obvious the consequences our actions are going to produce, right? For example, is it moral or immoral for you to buy a pair of shoes from Amazon? It's going to make you happy, right? All your friends are going to be like, nice Air Jordans, bro. But you got to think like, oh God, am I supporting child labor somewhere? Oh, do I want to give more money to Jeff Bezos? Is there any ethical consumption under capitalism? Right? Yeah, these are good questions. In our very complex world now, it's a lot more difficult to think along utilitarian lines because things are a lot more different than they were back then.
Like, even like the murderer has a family.
Right, yeah.
Who would be sad if they're gone. Like,
yeah.
They're causing suffering no matter what to somebody else. Even if you think you're doing better for, maybe it goes back to like how people don't agree with the death penalty because like, how are you any better than them if you're murdering? Well,
and we know that we've killed innocent people too, right?
Yeah.
So is it worth having it? Yeah, so I think there is something to that it's not easy to do the moral calculus because we can't predict the consequences of our actions all the time. Maybe not even the majority of the time. Maybe you saying something to someone in 5th grade is what inspired them to become a doctor, and you would never know it. Or maybe one thing that you said that you don't even remember has made somebody depressed and given them trauma, and they've been a sad person their whole life, right? So yeah, there's that. Another thing that you might ask is it ever possible to really determine if an action is right or wrong on this view? Why? Well, consequences just always produce more consequences. And so you can say, all right, I'm looking 5 years out and I'm going to look at the consequences. Based on what happened in the 5 years, I can determine what's right or wrong. But what you did is going to keep on producing consequences far, far into the future, never stopping. Right? So can you ever ultimately determine if an action is right or wrong? I throw this marker at you, that made you sad, but that inspires you to work harder, which makes you happy, but then you working hard makes your boyfriend feel sad because you're not spending enough time with him, but that causes him to work on your relationship more and connect with you more, so that makes everything, and flip-flopping. Yeah. And then you might just disagree that the morality of an action is determined by its consequences. Maybe you think intention matters more. Maybe you think that's what we should be evaluating people's actions on. Okay. Any final questions, concerns, comments? Okay, well, thank you for coming. Hope you found this interesting. Just to let you all know, the reading for next week, Monday, is going to be the toughest one all semester. So just get through it, but if you don't understand it, that's totally expected. Okay? Yeah.